Welcome to Part 3 of our lecture on what government does. In Part 2, we focused on the three largest social insurance programs: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, as well as defense spending. In this part of the lecture, we will learn about how the federal government pays for these programs. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify the major sources of federal revenues, describe how federal revenues and taxes have changed over time, and explain what deficit spending is and how it has changed over time. Here's another pie chart from the CBO. Notice that the United States takes in about $2.8 trillion in revenues every year. If you recall from Part 1, we learned that the United States government spends about $3.5 trillion each year. This means that they spend approximately $700 billion more than they take in every year. This is called deficit spending. We'll talk more about that in a second. But let's go back to the pie chart. Next, notice that the largest source of government income comes from individual income taxes, amounting to $1.3 trillion. This is followed by social insurance taxes, which also come directly from the paychecks of working Americans. Corporate taxes and other types of taxes, such as estate taxes, make up very little of the federal government's revenue. In fact, 80% of federal government revenues come from American citizens like you and I. How much does the federal government expect each American to pay in taxes? The answer depends on their income level. The tax code in the United States is progressive, with wealthier households paying a larger percentage of their income to taxes than poorer households. The top 20% wealthiest of Americans today pay around 85% of all tax dollars. However, the tax code has become less progressive over time. As this graph shows, in 1960, the top 0.01% of wealthiest Americans paid around 71.4% of their income to taxes. In the 2000s, that has dropped to around 34.2%. Meanwhile, the tax rate of the middle and upper middle class Americans has actually gone up since the 1960s. The source of government revenues has also fluctuated over time. This graph shows government revenue from income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate taxes, and other taxes. These gray bars represent periods of economic recession. What we can see is each time an economic downturn happens, revenues from individual income taxes goes down as well. This is partly due to an increase in unemployment and declining incomes, but it is also because the federal government tends to reduce the tax rate in an effort to boost an ailing economy. Corporate taxes, payroll taxes, and other taxes have remained relatively stable over time. As tax policy changes, so does the federal deficit. The federal deficit is the amount by which the government's expenditures exceed its revenues. This difference is made up by borrowing against itself. In other words, the federal government writes itself a big IOU every year. This figure shows us that the United States has had a deficit pretty constantly since the 1970s. The one exception is in the late 1990s, when a controversial tax hike under the Clinton administration increased federal revenues enough to cover spending. But then, in the early 2000s, the Bush tax cuts and wars in the Middle East brought the United States back into a deficit. If you notice the scary spike downward around 2008, that is the result of the Great Recession. During this time, taxation was reduced and spending was increased in an attempt to jumpstart the economy. As the economy has started to improve, the federal deficit has also started to shrink to more reasonable levels. There are two takeaways here. First, the government relies primarily on individuals for its revenues. Second, it tends to spend more than it brings in. We have now reached the end of Part 3 of our lecture on what government does. In Part 4, we will learn what is distinctive about the American way of government. But before starting Part 4, be sure to answer a few questions about government revenues to make sure you have mastered the material. See you again soon.